In YouTube's early days, the most popular search on the site was WoW. Not WoW as in how amazing YouTube is, but as in the abbreviation for World of Warcraft, a computer game that came out in 2004. By the mid-2000s, it had become a cultural phenomenon, dominating the online space and becoming one of the most popular video games of all time. The game proceeded through many expansions and transformations, and recently returned in its classic form, the original version of the game. A major cultural touchstone, in this video we'll talk about the game's origins and influences, the company Blizzard that made it, and how the game's success changed them. We'll talk about the game's history and lore, how it's a simulation of politics and economics. We'll talk about its design, how it has the ability not only to immerse the player, but to elicit feelings of discovery and wonder. We'll unpack the design principles that made the game so addicting, and how the dilution of these led to its decline. Finally, we'll explore the game's significance in culture, and why it has such an enduring legacy. The inspiration for World of Warcraft was the larger Warcraft series, which started in 1994. Ironically, the opening cinematic to the role-playing game professed a history of 10 years to the series. It's unlikely that the developers of the time thought they'd be making a game that's still talked about 20 years later. Unlike World of Warcraft, which is a role-playing game, the original Warcraft series consisted of strategy games, third-person perspective games, where the player managed towns and armies. Similar to the Dune series, Warcraft I was one of the first strategy games. The game had a simple plot. Later called the First War, in Warcraft I, a race of orcs emerged from a dark portal. Under a demonic influence, they launched an assault on the peaceful human kingdom of Stormwind, located in the world of Azeroth. Eventually, the city became so overwhelmed it was destroyed, and the humans were defeated. The orcs then founded their own settlement at a place called Blackrock Mountain. Warcraft II, later called the Second War, involved the orcs heading north and assaulting the human kingdom of Lordaeron. The game included naval combat for the first time. The orcs attacked by sea, ultimately failing and being captured and put in internment camps. Warcraft III was then the boldest expansion of the universe. From orcs and humans, the world added dwarves, elves, the undead, and demons. Unlike other strategy games like Age of Empires, Warcraft had a simple resource system and involved combat between small armies. Each unit took up a large amount of space on the screen and had abilities that required micromanagement. The game's units each felt impactful, and with distinctive art styles and strength in combat, were fulfilling to direct and use. The population system in Warcraft III, which punished your economy if you had too many units, encouraged you to keep your armies small. Unlike other strategy games, you were meant to focus on a hero unit, who, like in a role-playing game, you'd level up and equip with items. The game created a large number of icons for its items and spells. These art pieces were later used in World of Warcraft, and they helped in creating a strong visual identity for the series. The game revealed that the orcs, who originally lived on the world of Draenor, had come under a demonic influence. These forces, called the Burning Legion, sought to bring destruction throughout the universe. One orc, a warlock, had made a bargain with the demonic power, but in the process ended up enslaving his people. This malign influence was what caused him to leave for Azeroth and attack the human kingdom there. In Warcraft III, the orcs finally came out from under this destructive influence. One orc, Thrall, his name meaning slave, becomes the leader of his newly freed people. The game begins with a mysterious figure called the Prophet, who has the ability to take on the form of a crow, come as a herald of ill omen to the leaders of the game's factions. He warns the king of Lordaeron, Terenas, that a crisis is going to hit his worlds, and he must leave with his people immediately. The king rejects this, and the prophet later gives the same message to Thrall and to the human mage Jaina, who take his message more seriously. An interesting anecdote is that in the demo version of Warcraft III, it had its own unique content which developed the prophet's message to Thrall. It showed more of Thrall's response, and led to the founding myth of the orcs sailing to Kalimdor to create a new kingdom there. The main plot of Warcraft III follows the Prince of Lordaeron, Arthas, as he navigates the crisis the prophet warned about. Influenced by the same burning legion that corrupted the orcs, across Lordaeron a mysterious cult has appeared throughout the population, called the Cult of the Damned. As necromancers, they had discovered a form of immortality. They also learned to revive and enslave others. They planned to spread poison grain to kill and resurrect the population as the undead. Arthas begins as a paladin, trying to find a solution to the crisis. He does this with his mentor in his knightly order Uther and the mage Jaina. Eventually they reach the city of Stratholme, where the whole population has been infected with a shipment of infected grain. Arthas decides to purge the city, killing all its residents before they turn undead. This causes many of his followers, including Uther and Jaina, to abandon him. After killing his own subjects, Arthas learns that demons, led by the dreadlords called the Nathrazim, are responsible for the cult of necromancers in his kingdom. He becomes obsessed with hunting the dreadlord who was the source of the crisis. He leaves Lordaeron for the new continent of Northrend, trying to hunt him down. While there, he encounters a cursed sword called Frostmourne, which he takes as his blade, though when he retrieves it, it costs the life of a dwarven warrior who was one of his closest friends. With the sword, Arthas is able to hunt down and slay the demon, but under its influence becomes completely corrupted. And this, along with his fanaticism, cause him to turn into a slave to the same forces he once opposed. Arthas returns to Lordaeron and reunites with his father, but commits regicide and patricide, killing him and seizing control of the kingdom. No longer a paladin, Arthas becomes the first Death Knight and the new leader of the undead. Called the Scourge, he leads them to finish their conquest of the eastern kingdoms. He attacks Quel'Thalas, the kingdom of the High Elves, who are allies of Lordaeron. He wreaks a terrible path of destruction, leaving a literal scar on the land, and destroys the elves' capital and enslaves their population. In the process, he defeats and raises one of their heroes, the Ranger General Sylvanas, as one of his undead acolytes. With help from Arthas, a demon named Archimonde manifests in the world. He proceeds to destroy another ally of Lordaeron, the mystical city of the wizards called Dalaran. After, Arthas returns to Northrend, and his hold over the undead in Lordaeron weakens. Regaining her senses, Sylvanas leads a rebellion and a civil war against the Scourge. Her followers, called the Forsaken, consist of undead who regained self-consciousness, but were still scorned by the living. Meanwhile, on the unsettled continent of Kalimdor, the orcs land under the leadership of Thrall, who followed the advice of the prophet. They found a new kingdom there, far from the humans, and freed from the corrupting influences of the past. They create the realm of Durotar in the city of Orgrimmar, named after the heroes of their history. As they move inland, they encounter the Night Elves, an immortal race of druids and woodland keepers, who are deeply in tune with the natural world. An ancient people who lived in Kalimdor for ages, they're hostile to the encroaching orcs. Meanwhile, Jaina also comes to Kalimdor, building friendly relations with Thrall, and founding a small settlement of the humans who followed her, Thuramore. Finally, the Burning Legion invade and launch an attack on Kalimdor. They plan to besiege the World Tree of the Night Elves. Like that of Norse mythology, it is a kind of pillar that helps hold up the world. Here, the different factions are forced to fight the Burning Legion, and though the World Tree is destroyed, they defeat them. From here, the lore establishes the setting of World of Warcraft. The Night Elves, having lost their immortality, plant a new World Tree, Teldrassil, off the coast of Kalimdor. Jaina's father, Admiral Proudmoore, sails to Durotar to wipe out the fledgling orcs. Jaina decides to help Thrall and fight against fellow humans, ensuring the existence of Orgrimmar and creating a tense alliance between their cities. Meanwhile, Sylvanas founds a kingdom of the Forsaken on the ruins of Lordaeron, and elsewhere the kingdom of Stormwind is rebuilt after its destruction in the First War. One of the strategies of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, was to take an already existing technology and refine it into a simpler version that was easier for commercial use. This simple strategy led to the creation of the iPod and iPhone, some of the most popular consumer products of all time. Similarly, World of Warcraft looked at prior instances of the role-playing game and refined them into a perfected form. Though the developers didn't understand what they were creating, they achieved a unique balance in game design between the excessively punitive models of older games and the watered-down, excessively easy models of modern games. This found a happy medium that created a sense of psychological reward and maximized player investment in their characters. Called a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, World of Warcraft was most people's introduction to the genre. In this type of game, you create a character, choose a race and class to play as, and enter a digital world. Unlike other role-playing games where you play alone or with a small group of people, at World of Warcraft, you play in a simultaneous common world with thousands of other players. This factor is what makes it a unique experience, creating a sense of community even with the players you don't ally with, seeing the same faces at the start of the game that you do again at the end of it. There were MMOs that came out before World of Warcraft, like Ultima Online and Asheron's Call. However, the main inspiration for Blizzard was EverQuest. While it didn't approach the player count of World of Warcraft, EverQuest was very popular for its time. Like Warcraft would do after it, it followed a subscription-based model, requiring players to pay monthly to play the game. A totally new economic model for the video game, the subscription model allowed developers to maintain the servers and add new content over time. Unlike Warcraft, EverQuest was harsher and more punitive. The game was built on fighting enemies, called mobs, to gain experience and level your character up. Unlike Warcraft, though, it had few quests to immerse and guide the player. If your character died in EverQuest, you'd be able to resurrect, but the player would loot experience or progress. EverQuest didn't have flight points, making travel far slower and more onerous. Finally, its dungeons, which had the strongest enemies and the best loot, existed in one iteration in the world. While this promoted the idea of a synchronous, consistent world, if multiple people wanted to complete the same dungeon, in reality it made content inaccessible. The developers of Warcraft, many of them EverQuest players themselves, decided to make their game more accessible. The focus of the game became quests, adventures given to players by computer-controlled characters or NPCs. Quests made fighting enemies more purposeful, sent the player on missions of discovery, and served as tutorials for the game. In Warcraft, death was much more forgiving. Dying didn't cost the player experience. Instead, they would turn into a ghost at the local graveyard and have to run back to their corpse to revive themselves. Dying fundamentally just costs the player time. While players had to walk to see the scale of the world, Warcraft also had access to flight points, portals, ships, and zeppelins, which made traveling easier. Meanwhile, all classes, including the warrior, had access to the Hearthstone, which let them teleport to one inn or capital city in the world once every hour. Finally, dungeons in Warcraft would gain instance portals. While this made the world less synchronous than EverQuest, it meant each group would gain access to their own version of the dungeon, making the game's best content universally accessible. Other than EverQuest, another game that had an influence on Warcraft was Diablo II. Another Blizzard game, it was built by the Blizzard North team and came out in 2000. The game was a passion project led by the developer David Brevik and the Schaefer brothers. The team had created Diablo I as a prototype, then finally created their full vision of the game and its sequel. The game was an action role-playing game, meaning it focused on combat. It had a simple storyline, which was skippable, that centered on the player hunting a cabal of demons trying to invade the world. Popular in its own right, many of Warcraft's developers played Diablo and emulated its innovations in game design. To streamline the game, Diablo gave its quest givers bright exclamation marks over their heads, something recreated in Warcraft. Diablo's skill trees, broken into 3 per class, inspired the talent trees of Warcraft. 3 trees struck a good balance in creating enough variety of play for each class. Both Diablo and Warcraft chose to make resetting one's talents difficult, making it feel like one was making a permanent choice. Warcraft included items referencing Diablo, the use of mana as a resource, similar potions, auras, curses, and shouts, and similar schools of elemental magic. Other than video games, Warcraft took inspiration from fantasy. Its biggest influence came from the writer Tolkien, with Warcraft's world ultimately being a reimagination of The Lord of the Rings. While his books had been out for decades, the release of the Peter Jackson film in 2001 introduced Tolkien to a universal audience. In Tolkien's books, orcs were corrupted elves, who fell under the influence of Melkor, the dark god of the Lord of the Rings universe. In Warcraft, orcs had a similar tale. Having fallen under the influence of the Burning Legion, they'd been enslaved and given a malign nature. Tolkien's world includes long-lived elves who live in accord with nature, and a smaller, cleverer breed of orcs called goblins. His world contains dwarves, who are obsessed with wealth, and carve cities out of the insides of mountains. Dragons, themselves inspired by Tolkien's reading of the poem Beowulf, are jealous pursuers of wealth, and are portrayed as guarding treasure hoards. Meanwhile, the undead, while they didn't play a major role in Tolkien, appear in the character of Sauron, who's referred to as a necromancer in The Hobbit. A philologist, Tolkien was a student of languages and developed his own fictional language after studying Anglo-Saxon. Wanting to make use of it became the origin of his universe, returned it into Elvish in The Lord of the Rings. Finally, there are many sites in Warcraft inspired by Tolkien. 2 dwarves stand at the entrance to Loch Modan, similar to the Argonath. The peaceful Goldshire recalls the home of the hobbits. Meanwhile, the gates to the burning steppes from Redridge look like the gates of Mordor. And finally, Mount Doom, the location where the ring was made in Lord of the Rings, finds its recreation in Warcraft in Blackrock Mountain. Other than Tolkien, Warcraft uses a lot of ideas from mythology. As we mentioned before, the Night Elf's tree is inspired by Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, and a small Norse rune even appears on the player's experience bar. In Deadwind Pass, a message outside is a reference to Dante in the Inferno, warning players not to enter here. Scholomance comes from a reference in Bram Stoker's Dracula, a school of magic in the Carpathians. The devil would accept 13 students here who would learn magic from him. At the end of their schooling, he would take one of the students as payment. Most of the classes in the game have names that derive from the mystics of history. The Druids were the ancient priesthood of the Celts, associated with nature and with the belief in reincarnation. The mage comes from the Magi of the old Persian religion, the term over time becoming the basis for our words magic and magician. The priest and paladin derive from medieval Christianity, with the paladin himself coming from the Knights of Charlemagne. The characters serve the light, which in-game is similar to Christianity, though it uses impersonal language instead. The game includes other mythological influences in its bestiary, for example in the succubus, centaur, and harpy. World of Warcraft came out in November 2004, and had its first winter event in December of that year. The game included a large number of CDs to install the game, coming out before Steam, or the idea of digital distribution. It came with a printed manual, a staple of games in the time period. Not only did it include unique art and maps, it had tutorials on the game's mechanics and abilities. The game's website itself was filled with art, profession guides, and class descriptions. Simple, well-made, and appealing, it was a good tool to bring new players in. It was an interesting site to bookmark when there wasn't much else on the internet. The website also had its own forum, where players could talk about the game, solicit responses from Blizzard, or engage in the trolling characteristic of the 2000s. The game went with simple cartoonish graphics, which proved to be a prudent design decision. Warcraft could be played on all computers in the 2000s, and its graphics were resilient and aged excellently for many years, until they were finally remastered in the 2010s. The game had an opening cinematic which showed off each race and the different class abilities. It also showed the conflict that defined the series. For those who never played World of Warcraft, the basic concept involves creating a character or avatar and leveling them up from 1 to 60. There are two factions in the game, the Horde and Alliance, who are hostile to each other in the game's lore. The factions date back to the First War, or Warcraft I, the Horde consisting of the orcs who attacked Stormwind, and the Alliance the humans who resisted them. On each faction were 4 races the player could choose from. The Alliance were popular, as it had the archetypal races of Tolkien, humans, elves, and dwarves. Meanwhile, the Horde had the orc, undead, and tauren. You then picked a class which filled the archetypes of role-playing games, the roles of the warrior, magician, and healer. Each class filled a niche, whether protecting other characters, which was called tanking, dealing damage, or healing allies. New players began in small, safe, and finite areas called starting zones, and were slowly initiated into the game. The starting area taught basic principles, including things like auto-attack, before guiding the player to other areas. The player's first challenge was to talk to the non-player character, or NPC, in front of them, when they entered the game, with the bright yellow exclamation mark over his head. He would send you on a quest that would slowly guide you through the game. A combat-based game, in Warcraft you learn your class's skills and how to use them while questing, before being sent to your class trainer for the first time. The game included a rested system, adding an experience boost for players who logged out in an inn or a big city. This created a mechanic that allowed players who had to take breaks be able to catch up with their friends. As you played the game, you could add other players to your friends list to stay in contact with them, and join guilds of dozens or hundreds of other players. Your first town, like Goldshire for the humans, started to reduce the amount of hand-holding you felt. Quests were sparser and less directed, and if you pulled too many enemies, you could die. It became harder to gain levels, but you still felt a sense of reward each time you did, as you'd unlock new abilities for your class to try out. Eventually you would make your way to one of the capital cities. Most of these included a grand entrance to impress players for the first time. These included Stormwind's Valley of Heroes, which also triggered a unique musical score, or the massive gates of Ironforge, which opened into a city that was literally built into a mountain. Getting the scale of cities right in a game is difficult. You want the cities to be large, impressing the player, but not so large there's no population density to occupy it. Blizzard was able to achieve this careful balance, creating common areas for players to idle in, while creating a scale that invoked wonder from them. Each capital had all the class trainers in it, and as you leveled, you'd have to return to it to learn new skills. After visiting the capital, the game sent you on your first flight points, showing the fastest way of going from town to town. It also showed you boats, zeppelins, and the tram, forms of public transportation in the game. For a young person starting the game in the wintertime, there's something magical about beginning in the dwarven zone of Dun Morogh, exploring a wintertime atmosphere, then making it to Ironforge and seeing Greatfather Winter. Due to experiences like this, starting the game in childhood can create a lifelong effect. We've spoken about brand imprinting before, how McDonald's is associated with warm and pleasant feelings, from the wholesome times of getting a Happy Meal with your parents in youth. Brand imprinting is extremely impactful and can affect someone's feelings about a product for a lifetime. Though the Warcraft developers just wanted to make the best game they could, they unintentionally produced this effect. In the 1920s, the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget theorized on the role of play. He looked at its ubiquity in nature, for example in lion cubs pouncing and fighting their siblings, and tried to apply it to humans. Though earlier versions of psychology had discouraged play and encouraged discipline, Piaget's work emphasized the opposite. He learned play has a crucial effect in developing us. It teaches us how to navigate conflict and socializes us. It educates us and prepares us for the world. For young people playing World of Warcraft, the game is most impactful when you're learning about the world for the first time. The game becomes a vehicle for learning and discovery about the world. While in childhood you may be baffled by your own existence, the game world is a comfort because it's an environment that's structured and comprehensible. The game teaches language and new concepts, and it teaches how to build talents and skills that produce the best effect. One of the things about video games in the 90s was that clear concepts of game design didn't exist. It was also difficult to access reviews. Often you'd go into a store, have only the box and its art to make a judgment off of, and have to buy it and take the risk of whether it was good or not. The angry video game nerd built his whole channel around this principle. Its creator, James Rolfe, tortures himself by playing terrible games from the past, turning into a profane, rage-filled alcoholic in consequence. If you bought a bad game in the 90s, which also often lacked save points, you'd be forced to play the same opening level again and again, and at the time the simple novelty of video games made it something you'd do nevertheless. With these low expectations, if you finished a starting zone like Dunmoreau, you'd be genuinely surprised to see that it wasn't the end of the game, and that there was a whole other zone to explore, as large as the one you just exited. In its early days, there were no guides to explain the game, and you had to discover everything on your own. Quests gave you vague directions, and you had to explore, to find where they were referring to. This is one of the lost experiences of our time, as now there are a litany of guides online for whatever game you're playing, and it's impossible to recreate the illusion you're discovering something for the first time. In its early days, competition and achievement weren't yet a part of the experience of World of Warcraft. Instead, players simply sat around campfires in Goldshire, just in wonder of the new social experience created by the game. Few players committed to a class, instead starting over multiple times, to see each starting zone and which they liked best. In Diablo, you distributed stat points with each level, choosing your amounts of health, mana, strength, and agility. World of Warcraft didn't allow this, instead giving predetermined levels of stats with each level, and only allowing character customization through items. You might think this would reduce your identification with your character, but the long journey of getting to 60, your fixed appearance, your slow investment of talent points, and the strong effect items did have on your character caused you to see your avatar as an extension of yourself. Ultimately, World of Warcraft has a potent ability to fill the player with nostalgia, a departure from the banal work of daily life. In game, you can melt away, forget life's troubles, and make friends in a virtual world. If you look at the popularity the game retains online, you can see for many its creation of a virtual youth. Though a role-playing game, World of Warcraft showed its strategy game origins and the politics of its different factions. If we use the game's player versus player zones as a reference, the kingdoms of the different races are fledgling and small. One of the most established, not having fallen in any of the wars, is the dwarven kingdom of Ironforge. Inspired by Tolkien's Erebor, it's a great metropolis carved into the earth. Though not exploited due to the dwarves' insular nature, it's also at a good location for trade. On a real political map, Ironforge would be in one of the best situations to secure itself and project power externally. The one surviving kingdom of the humans, and the lore of Warcraft, Stormwind is only recently rebuilt, having been destroyed by the orcs in the First War. In theory, it controls one of the largest areas, including Westfall, Red Ridge, and Duskwood, though due to internal corruption and its regency under a child king, its government is dysfunctional. Meanwhile, the orcs are settler colonists in Kalimdor, building a new kingdom for themselves out of the dry land of the eastern part of the continent. The Night Elves, recalling Tolkien, are ancient and immortal, but in their harmony with nature, don't have the economic development of the other states. Having lost their world tree and immortality, they've grown a new world tree off the coast of Kalimdor, which is in some ways viewed as selfish. From it, they've been reduced to a kind of recolonization of their own lands, resettling the ruins that were the monoliths of their own ancient great empire, similar to Renaissance Italians living in the ruins of Rome. In Lordaeron, the undead freed from slavery to Arthas, now called the Lich King, created a new kingdom on its ruins. Misunderstood and mistrusted by everyone, at the start of Classic, they're new allies of the orcs, and actually start at a neutral opinion with them in the Tauren. The number of classes in World of Warcraft was high. giving a large diversity of experiences and ensuring you'd meet all kinds of different players in your travels. The number of classes meant a large number of abilities for the player to learn about. To navigate the game, not only did you have to learn your own class, but you also needed a basic understanding of the other classes' skills and roles. A central design pillar was each class had abilities that were unique to them. They each had a service or power that gave them value in a group. This is one of the principles that made Classic so fulfilling, that just by existing, your class gave you intrinsic value. You can even see this if you make a group. If you have 3 of the same class, you lack the utility of variety, like some classes having decurse, pets that can off-tank, different damage types, or different buffs. Later versions of the game would water this down, with everyone being able to do everything, diluting the feeling of uniqueness. The warrior, a melee fighter, was the most effective at tanking, getting enemies to focus their attacks on them. They had the most damage mitigation, the highest health, and the most threat-generating abilities. The warrior was the most valued class for dungeons, and if knowledgeable was the best party leader. The concept was there would be enough warriors, because every race was able to play the class. Similar to the warrior was the paladin. The paladin had tanking and damage trees, but in Classic was unviable in these roles. Instead, they distinguished themselves as the best single-target healer. With the talent Illumination and proper gearing, the paladin could effectively never run out of mana. They were also unique due to their invulnerability shields, and their only being playable on the Alliance faction. The mage was a caster who could deal massive damage through magic, and filled many utilitarian roles. They could conjure free food and water for a party, had the strongest area of effect spells, like Blizzard, and had access to portals allowing easy travel. They also had access to Polymorph, which was the best crowd control spell in the game. Turning an enemy into a harmless sheep, it had a fast cast time, could be applied indefinitely, and was usable on the most common enemies, humanoids and beasts. In the original game, enemies were much stronger, which meant fighting a large group was difficult or cost too much mana. Thus, it was necessary for groups to use crowd control abilities. The Warlock was a dark caster who had access to a pet. He had the Imp, whose blood pacts could provide the warrior with extra health. He had a Soul Stone which could let the priest resurrect if the players wiped or all died in a dungeon, preventing them from having to run back, and he could summon party members anywhere from across the world to the entrance of a dungeon. The Druid was an adaptable, jack-of-all-trades class, able to swap between different roles. Depending on who was missing, a Druid could become a healer, tank, caster, or rogue. They could change into animals, including a travel form and a water form. They had a combat-based resurrection spell, and unique heals that focused on healing over time. The Priest was the game's central healer. He managed his mana through the Spirit system, allowing it to recover in combat if he stopped casting for 5 seconds. He could resurrect fallen allies, and had access to Fortitude, the strongest buff in the game. This ability would increase an ally's health for 30 minutes, and could be recast at any time. Other classes included the Rogue, who had access to stealth, recalling games like Thief. The Rogue was most effective when a warrior held the enemy's threat, allowing them to stab their enemies in the back. The Hunter filled the role of an archer or marksman, and managed a pet they tamed from the wild. Unlike other classes, they had to keep track of the categories of food they were using, as some animals only ate meat and others fruit. Other players didn't even notice these categories, showing the layers of the game. Finally, the Shaman, limited only to the Horde, combined the roles of a melee fighter, healer, and caster, and in Classic was very capable at player versus player or PvP combat. As the game added expansion packs, the vision of class uniqueness gradually diminished, and more classes were able to fill different roles. The Paladin became a viable tank, which made the Warrior less unique, and when dungeons added summoning stones at their entrances, there was no longer a benefit to having a Warlock as a party member. Later expansions added portals to every major city, destroying the uniqueness of the mage to get these. While this change made sense due to the increasing scale of the game, it showed how the finite world of Classic achieved a balance between size and population density. The game's first expansion, The Burning Crusade, also made the Paladin and Shaman, originally unique to the Alliance and Horde respectively, playable by both sides. In consequence, the expansions had a process of equalizing and watering down the game. The attention to detail put into World of Warcraft is one of its most endearing qualities. Particularly if you started the game as a young person, there were always more secrets to discover, instilling the world with a sense of wonder. The human zones, some of the first designed, have a perfect synergy between each other, with their quests overlapping and a larger narrative about the kingdom. The aesthetic changes, like that between Elwynn to Westfall, could even match real-life changes between the seasons, depending on when you were playing, and continue later if the player entered Duskwood in October. The mayor of Redridge, under siege by orcs, sends the player on a search for aid, but his messages show the corruption throughout Stormwind and the dire state of the provinces. The human quests send players walking back and forth through Elwynn, causing low levels to see high-level players, and create the feel of an active world that's being lived in. Mountains were usually used as barriers between zones, but the human zones were unique, for using rivers instead of mountains to separate their zones. This only recurred rarely, like on the border between Durotar and the Barrens, and in the barrier between the Plaguelands. As one travels through Elwynn Forest and Stormwind, one can imagine the warlocks making new discoveries in demonology, hiding in the basement of the slaughtered lamb, and the lore they have to hide their practices from society, their magic having caused the Burning Legion to turn their attention to Azeroth in the first place. The park in Stormwind, while having little utility on normal servers, was used as a gathering area on role-playing servers, people using its tavern as a place to congregate. In the human zone Westfall, the developers broke convention. Most zones would have a town which contained the flight point and quests for the player. In Westfall, though its signs all still pointed toward Moonbrook, the town had been taken over by the bandits called the Defias Brotherhood. Duskwood contained a vast underground crypt, unique in the game. It even had 2 entrances, a hidden path in the back, connecting them, and rewarding the player who explored closely. Dunmoreau, a snowy zone, had its cold atmosphere broken when you went into the dwarves' buildings, its taverns and forges, giving a feeling of coziness in contrast to the environment. In the second dwarven zone, Loch Modan, the dwarves built the Ironrot Dam. A testament to engineering, it literally shaped the land, creating the loch separate from the wetlands beneath it. The Undercity had the old capital of Lordaeron above it, including the entrance from the Warcraft cinematic, where Arthas returns from Northrend. It has a throne room where he kills his father, with ghostly murmurings of their last conversation, hearable in the background if the player puts their volume up. In a corner of Silverpine, a road led south to a blocked-off zone, Gilneas, which was one of the old human kingdoms that sealed itself off when the Scourge came. Outside of its huge impenetrable walls were refugees, not let in, who were friendly to the Alliance, though in characteristic Blizzard humor, one blind trader was friendly with everyone. Characteristic to Blizzard, high-level werewolves would stalk Silverpine Forest, ambushing and killing unsuspecting low-level players. These werewolves came from the zone's dungeon, Shadowfang Keep, which itself stood above a town, Pyrewood Village. During the day, the town was friendly to the Alliance, and the player could even use the vendors in town. At night, however, its vendors turned into werewolves, who were hostile to everyone. Silverpine and Hillsbrad finally had unique NPCs, enemies that were hostile to the Horde, but friendly to the Alliance, like the roaming Dalaran mages. The Night Elves were isolated from everyone. They started on Teldrassil, the New World Tree, and a solitary island off the coast of Kalimdor. Their city Darnassus was beautifully designed, but so far out of the way it was rarely visited by players. The Night Elf zones had an aura of mystery when the game was new, and its graphics were up to date. Their forests were mystical and mysterious, with cliffs and trees requiring circuitous and sometimes hidden routes to reach different sites. In Teldrassil, the Night Elves' land, one can explore the barrow dens, underground tunnels where the sleeping druids lie, Unique in the game, Night Elf players are able to explore these barrows that aren't used elsewhere. When the game was new, physical separation had a big impact on the world. Zones like Darkshore and Ashenvale were uniquely crowded with Night Elves. There were few guides, and new players didn't know how to go from the Night Elf to the human and dwarf zones. Today, players know all the tricks, including how to die and revive on the other side of the mountain. The earliest players didn't know Menethil's road led to a dwarven tunnel, and the crocodiles discouraged players from exploring. Since most players kept restarting to try different classes and starting zones, this meant for a while there were few level 30 players who went between the two alliance areas. The zone Tanaris, with its dunes stretching forever in the distance, showed the serenity one can gain from the ambience of a virtual environment. The city of Dalaran, destroyed in Warcraft III, returned in Classic, but was concealed behind a magical dome, suggesting it would be rebuilt later. High Elves, members of the Alliance from Warcraft III, weren't playable, but were still discoverable in rare instances in Alliance cities. One was in the Mage Tower in Stormwind, though you could find others at the Farstrider Lodge and Loch Modan as well. Another lost race was the Broken, the original version of the Draenei. They had a small village in the Swamp of Sorrows most players didn't know about. It didn't have a flight path and only had one quest. Desolus was a unique zone to visit when the game was new. As an Alliance player, almost no one went there, or even seemed to know about the zone at all. This made it feel like it was content made just for you. Living up to its name, it had an interesting quest to ally with one of the Centaur tribes. The zone had a point of interest, a forgotten tower on the coast, like those from Lord of the Rings. This building suggested we might visit it someday on a higher level quest. Later, the zone would be expanded with more content added. In Deadwind Pass was the Karazhan Tower, a unique site but unimplemented. The zone contained a hidden crypt, which required you to die and resurrect behind a locked gate to explore it. The most famous room here was the Chamber of Upside-Down Sinners. The zone of Dustwallow Marsh, unfinished other than a quest where you investigate the arson of a tavern, had an Easter egg, the missing king of Stormwind, imprisoned by the Naga on Alkaz Island. In the Badlands, there's a crypt referencing the Age of Conan, the story where he finds a mummified king from ancient times. Zul'Farrak, originally a passion project made by one person, had so much detail it was turned into a dungeon. It had a unique event where you fought with another party, and in its early days had secrets, like the right side boss, who players always missed. To summon a boss in the Sunken Temple dungeon, the players had to spread out across the different pillars in a large room, then activate them in the right order. Similar to the cairn stones in Diablo, this required the group to coordinate, and each player had their time to activate the right one. The Blasted Lands, though one of the least developed zones in the game, contained a massive mine to explore that was friendly to the Alliance. Though much like other unfinished content, it lacks a reason to go through it. In the Hinterlands, a diligent explorer can find a hidden ravine, offering a path between Airy Peak and the Plaguelands. If discovered, it allows the player a swift travel to Scholomance if they're doing the dungeon. The island of Caer Darrow itself is another mystery in the game. Usually in their 50s, players discover the Western Plaguelands and eventually make their way to the island. While the rest of the zone is filled with hostile enemies, the island is empty, giving the player a feeling of suspense. Later, if one returns as a ghost, one finds the island inhabited by spirits, and the entrance to Scholomance hidden behind a locked door. One of the best designed dungeons, showing the influence of older role-playing games, is Blackrock Depths. The dungeon portrays an entire dwarven city and social system with an emperor, though after unearthing the fire elementals, the Dark Iron Clan have since become their servants. The dungeon is vast, and it's so large runs can be advertised as running one wing or another. The dungeon shows diplomats, generals, and inventors. It shows other factions coming to parley with the dwarves. It even has a friendly tavern, where the player can take a break from the size of the dungeon, and at the end of it they can free the princess of Ironforge. Some dungeons in World of Warcraft required keys to open them, forcing the player to clear content in a linear way. Since some keys could be rare, They gave players who had them a sense of intrinsic worth. The key to Upper Blackrock Spire in particular, necessary to access one of the game's early raids, required the player to farm and complete a complicated quest in Lower Blackrock Spire first. Blizzard in the early 2000s had a unique charm. Small details in World of Warcraft showed a human rather than corporate origin to its design. The game had many transformations that existed just for entertainment. If you got the right item, you could change your character's appearance. A fish from the Barrens, the Deviant Delight, could turn you into a pirate or a ninja. A potion from Tanaris could shrink you or change you into a skeleton. Alliance players could get the Furbog Wand if they stopped midway through the Rain's cleansing quest on Ashenvale. Finally, there was the trinket, the Orb of Deception. Each race had an opposite it would turn into, like a gnome into a Tauren. Other charming items were Piccolo's flute from Stratholme, which forced all the players around you to dance, the Barov peasant collar, and the firewater from Winterspring that made you taller. The game was filled with other small details, showing Blizzard's sense of humor. Some items included the One Ring and the carrot on the stick that made your mount faster. The warrior's berserker stance used the icon of an angry dwarf. Sleeping NPCs would have little Z's above their heads, while the dwarves had the racial ability to find treasure. Enchanted swords would glow, so players would get enchants just for that effect. Your character could get drunk in-game, which would blur your vision and cause you to stagger and slur your speech. The paladin had just enough time on their shield they could use their hearthstone in it, which soon became a joke. Meanwhile, the sea giants would produce green fart bubbles, while the ogres and Alterac didn't have a good means of waste disposal. One of the funniest items was the snowball in the old version of the game. In its initial version, it would stun whoever you threw it at. The possibilities for this with comedy were endless. You could completely stunlock other players if a group of people threw snowballs at them. One of the challenges of engaging players is dealing with monotony. Being stuck in the same environment and doing the same tasks over and over start to wear on a player. One of the ways Warcraft deals with this is by creating tone shifts between zones. The player may spend 3 to 5 hours in each zone, long enough to invest them before the environment starts to get tedious. The green forests of Elwyn then change to the autumn of Westfall, while the dryness of the Barrens shifts to the mystery of Ashenvale. These shifts even happen within dungeons themselves, trying to avoid monotony for the player. The areas between zones where they change are called liminal spaces, areas of transition from one place to another. Because some of these environmental shifts are so stark, these places of transition are meaningful. Liminal areas are often empty spaces, places that give us forced moments of contemplation, moments where we have a time to be with ourselves. One of these is the transition from Redridge to Duskwood. After traversing the human zones, the player finally enters Duskwood. If they're playing for the first time, they're usually following a quest sending them there, and enter along the long, narrow path in the northeast of the zone. This transition is very well done. From the light of the previous zones, the trees suddenly phase in and the coast disappears. The brightness of the former zones fades away, and the suspense grows as the player feels there's something threatening here. The player passes a goblin merchant guarded by a night watchman. Your first encounter with the goblin as an alliance player, making the place seem different and alive. You go past a manor with high-level enemies, who kill you if you get too close. Finally, by the time you reach the town of Darkshire, you're totally immersed in the aesthetic of the zone. What's unique about Duskwood is it's not only an environment change, but a tone change. Duskwood differentiates itself by changing Warcraft from an adventure fantasy into a horror game. In its early version, it also only had one graveyard in the east side of the zone, punishing the player for dying elsewhere. Throughout the zone, you unravel its horrors and mysteries, and the powers that make it haunted. The dwarven tunnels, like those between Coldridge and the rest of Dunmorrow, are liminal spaces. They give the player a sense of accomplishment and progress as they move out of the smaller, protected spaces to increasingly venture into the larger world. You finally exit the last of these when you leave the last tunnel for the wetlands, encountering orcs along the way. Another liminal space is the bridge between the wetlands and Arathi Highlands, enterable and explorable, with secrets that reward the player. If you go down to the coast below, you can find a message from a slain dwarf, who you can return to his wife in Ironforge. The Deep Run tram, the public transport between Ironforge and Stormwind, is deeply memorable the first time you use it. Built by the gnomes, it bypasses traveling through the high-level zones, and has an Easter egg in its water segment with a reference to the Loch Ness Monster. The tram has forced intervals of waiting, encouraging the player to sit on the benches and talk to the other players there. The transition between Desolace and Feralis recalls old fantasy games like Asheron's Call. One of the most desolate places in the game, it has a kind of solemn feeling to its road, pointing to the untraveled area of northern Feralis. Another place of transition is Thoradin's Wall, which, though decrepit, suggests an ancient history the player is unaware of. In the north of Felwood is a furbog tunnel, filled with the bear-like creatures. They start as aggressive, and if the player is impatient and wants to reach Winter Spring quickly, they can just kill them to reach the new zone. But more patient players can do the quest outside, and raise their reputation to unfriendly, saving them the time of fighting and letting them pass through the tunnel unmolested. Exiting the tunnel is one of the most beautiful empty spaces in Azeroth. After the corruption of Felwood and the unpleasantness of going through the tunnel, you emerge into a serene winter landscape, recalling the experience of Dun Morogh. After the corruption of the Prior Zone, the pristine winter is a symbol of rebirth, the zone living up to its name, of combining winter and spring. Eventually you traverse the zone and reach the goblin town of Everlook. Moonglade, where druids visit at a low level, is concealed behind the Furbog Tunnel and its surrounding high-level zones. Only at the very end of the game can non-druids enter and explore it. In the Plaguelands is Corrin's Crossing, a crossroads for traveling the zone. These towns would usually be places of safety for the player, but here the expectation is inverted, with it being a hostile town instead. Some last liminal spaces occur in the Plaguelands. Here the undead areas suddenly break into uncorrupted parts, enclaves of the religious order of the Scarlet Crusade, and Hearthglen and Tyr's Hand. World of Warcraft had many memorable quests, taking the player on epic journeys that spanned the world. Some of the most memorable of these on the Alliance side included the Defias Brotherhood, Stalvin, and Warlock Succubus quests. When a human player enters the game for the first time, one of the first enemies they encounter are the bandits of the Defias Brotherhood. The Marshal in Northshire Valley sends you to collect their bandanas, and they return later as enemies throughout Elwyn Forest. The human zones are some of the most well-designed, with zones like Westfall dating back to the earliest stages of the game's development in the late 90s. Elwyn, Westfall, Redridge, and Duskwood create an overarching storyline, sending the player from zone to zone, unraveling a larger narrative. The player learns that a stonemason guild was hired to rebuild Stormwind after it was destroyed in the First War. After doing so, they were supposed to be paid, but a corrupt noble, Katrana Prestor, prevented this. In consequence, they turned to banditry to take the payment they felt was theirs. To make matters worse, the government is weak under a child king, and Prestor arranges to have the king's armies sent on interventions far away. This situation explains the need of the player to help the characters in the zones, and unravel the corruption that's taken over Stormwind. The Defias are even more powerful in Westfall, where they've taken over the zone's town Moonbrook, depriving it of a questing hub. The player helps the farmers fight the bandits, before finally finding their lair in the dead mines under Moonbrook. In their first dungeon in the game, the player descends with a group of allies, and defeats the Defias leader Van Cleef. In doing so, you discover they had been building a ship to release on and besiege Stormwind. Your assault on the mines prevents this. The Defias quest continues with you unraveling a web of intrigue, before finally reaching its conclusion at the end of the game. Here you free a marshal who's been imprisoned for discovering the corruption in the kingdom. After freeing him, you proceed through Stormwind and reveal that a dragon, Onyxia, disguised herself as Prestor to destroy the kingdom from within. This plot finally resolves in one of the game's raids, where you fight Onyxia in Dustwallow Marsh in her lair. When the player enters Duskwood for the first time, they pass Manor Mistmantle, which is filled with high-level ghouls. If a player gets too close, they're killed, so they learn to stay away. As the player goes through the zone, no quests take them there, so they begin to forget about the location, though it has a significance later on. The Legend of Stalvin is a long travel-based quest that takes the player through the various human zones. It tells the tale of a teacher, Stalvin, who's hired to teach a young girl, Taloa. He becomes infatuated with her and overreads their interactions, becoming delusional and thinking they're in love. When she gets married, he's filled with confusion and resentment. He kills her and her husband out of envy, creating a curse and turning himself undead. The player unpacks this story through journal entries they get from following the quest. They find an entry in a locker in the abandoned schoolhouse in Moonbrook. They find more information at the Goldshire Inn, and their travels again to the Eastvale logging camp help unravel the mystery. In the quest's conclusion, the player returns to the manor and kills Stalvin, ending the curse. Duskwood is filled with many memorable quests. In another, a townswoman sends the player to the cemetery, where an old hermit lives alone in the woods. Concerned about his welfare, she sends you to check in on him, and you end up running errands for him, retrieving the things he needs. As you proceed through the quest, he becomes more and more suspicious, the story suggesting he has other motives. Finally, he finishes his work, and it's revealed he's a necromancer, and you've been helping him create a monster of the undead, an abomination called Stitches. In characteristic Blizzard fashion, the abomination then proceeds through the zone, killing unsuspecting low-level players, and creating a defining experience for Duskwood. Finally, he advances on Darkshire, taking over the town, unless the players can stop him. The quest lets the player change the world by creating the abomination, which in characteristic Blizzard charm, slaughters unsuspecting low-level players. One of the features of Classic was its class-specific quests. These often put the players on long adventures to teach them skills, or reward them with valuable items. One of the most memorable was the Alliance Warlock's quest to unlock the Succubus at level 20. When the game was new, players followed quests closely and tended to stay in the zones they started in. The Warlock's quest was unique because it put you on a long adventure. From the basement of the Slaughtered Lamb in Stormwind, you had to speak to a warlock in the Barrens. If you'd never been to the Dwarven Lands, this took you through the Deep Run Tram, through Dunmorrow and Loch Modan, and then through the Wetlands, which was a level 30 zone. Dodging high-level crocodiles trying to kill you, you finally reach Menethil Harbor, far too early for your level. You then have to learn the ship system and sail to Thuramore. From there you traverse Dustwallow Marsh, also filled with high-level enemies. It being an unfinished zone, its emptiness and long winding path gave it a sense of suspense. Finally you'd reach the Barrens, a huge zone in Horde territory. You'd then have to find the NPC, relying only on the quest's vague directions. Simply to find him felt like a great accomplishment, something other players wouldn't be able to achieve. He then sent you north to the Night Elf zone of Ashenvale. To get there you'd have to dodge the Horde town of the Crossroads, then find the Alliance's open path that bypassed the Orcish wall. As you went through Ashenvale, you'd feel out of place, as a demonologist amongst the Night Elves. Again relying on vague directions, you'd make your way to the lost tree of the tragic lovers. Finally, you'd find the branch of the tree and return it to Stormwind, usually by Hearthstone. The uniqueness of this quest lied in it breaking convention. It was based mostly on traveler discovery, taking you through zones that were too high for your level. Very few quests would have you intentionally do this, instead guiding you on safe paths. The quests gave you an experience few others of your level would know, showing you content in excess of your level. The scale of World of Warcraft meant a lot of its content went uncompleted. which, though unintentional, created a sense of mystery in the game. Flight paths gave players vision of inaccessible areas, like the Troll Village below Moonglade and the Ironforge airfield. These sites would encourage players to try to reach them, using tactics like wall jumping to get to places like the mountain peak above Ironforge. The zones before Hyjal seemed to be building to a conclusion there, but the zone wasn't implemented. However, if players did venture there, they could find the decomposing skeleton of the demon Archimond. Some players were fascinated by Uldum, an abandoned dwarven hold in Tanaris that went unimplemented, while others explored the hold of Grim Batol in the wetlands. Neglected areas, like Grim Batol or the Swamp of Sorrows, had secrets like the rare Crimson or Emerald Dragon Whelp Pet. Gnomragon, the city of the gnomes, had been taken over by Trogs, but after finishing the dungeon, players wondered if the gnomes would ever regain their city. The Emerald Dream Portals, guarded by high-level dragons, existed in 4 secluded places in the world, and were meant to take the player to the dream world of the Druids. Players would try to fight these dragons, but would be disappointed there was no reward, and they didn't drop any items. In some places, the sparser, unfinished environments piqued an interest in exploration, and with fewer friendly NPCs, the ones you did meet were more memorable and interesting. The sparser, emptier worlds at the end of the game also made the final sprint to 60 more challenging and rewarding. One of the defining pieces of Classic, which wasn't implemented in later expansions, were overworld dungeons. While the game had instance dungeons that created unique versions for every group, it also had smaller, open-air dungeons that required parties to complete. Quests offered high rewards for players completing these, in addition to the extra experience gained from fighting elite enemies. At the same time, it was hard to find groups for these, like the elite quests in Stromgarde. One was the Ogre Compound in Loch Modan. These enemies required at least a 2-person party, like a healer and a tank, to clear through. The compound had a boss who's deep in the cave. The area had a general quest for experience, and a quest to fight the boss that rewarded one of the best early game rings. Group quests like those of the ogres in Loch Modan, or areas filled with large numbers of enemies that respawn quickly, like the Stone Splitter Gorge in Loch Modan, rewarded players and offered a smoother experience if they grouped. Since the game had no dungeon finder, forcing players to advertise their groups and ask for others in text channels created a lot of forced socialization. Finally, in Felwood, an area many people miss due to its generic entrance, is Jadenar, the unique uninstanced dungeon there. Felwood seems like a neglected zone, but holds a surprise with this vast, sprawling dungeon that lacks quests to explore it. Today, most Classic servers use the 1.12 patch of the game, which was the final version of Classic before the expansion pack, The Burning Crusade. Yet 1.12 came out in 2006, 2 years after the release of the game. It brought Classic into a basic state of balance and completion, though some shortcomings remained, like the priest's holy tree. This meant there was almost 2 years of the game prior to it where the game was a prototype. Yet I wanted to explore this early period of the raw and rapidly changing game, as it was one of the most interesting periods in Warcraft's history. In these early versions of the game, classes were imbalanced and completely unviable in certain roles. There was little knowledge of the game, and people didn't understand the concepts of the tank, damage, or healer roles. People would attempt instances with 3 hunters, a mage, and a druid, and be unaware of the bad group composition. The early game had a number of abortive ideas it didn't end up pursuing. The priest's inner fire also gave attack power, and in its original form didn't have charges, making it a better spell. With their high stamina, warlocks had a vague concept of being able to tank, including a threat-generating spell and Searing Pain. The warlock also had the Firestone and Spellstone, the first even granting melee damage, abandoned concepts that had little use. The warlock originally didn't have Death Coil or Soul Link, which were added to the game to improve their survivability. and early quests gave the enchanted blood robe, but the scythe quest was added later. Many zones were incomplete or sparse. The original Searing Gorge was expanded with the Thorium Brotherhood added to it. The Eastern Plaguelands were expanded as well, getting new content along with the Naxxramas patch. Slimes originally had no loot, and the Ogre had a different looking model. Some of the rarest items in the game trace back to this time. All races originally had unarmored epic horses. The humans had unique colors for theirs that weren't recreated later. This means the oldest players, likely veteran MMO gamers, as they needed 1,000 gold to buy a horse at that time, have access to these ancient mounts. As Blizzard proceeded through the patches, Moradon was added, creating a dungeon for players in the level 50 range. After this came improvements in PvP. The game had a player versus player system, where the Alliance and Horde could fight each other. However, there was no ranking or progress system to reward this. A major patch created a series of ranks that were distributed based on how many times you beat enemies in combat. The rewards for these were similar to those of raiding. For the first time, players had access to an alternative to raiding to receive endgame gear. At the same time, Blizzard created one of the worst grinds in the game. The player was ranked relative to every other player on their faction, meaning they were competing more with their own side for honor than the enemy. The system required many hours a week to compete in it, as opposed to the 4 hours a week required by raiders. The initial system even required players to maintain their rank, to continue to wear their gear. The player versus player system added an officer's quarters, an instanced area, where only high-ranking players could go. The sense of exclusion made players want to rank higher. After the PvP system was implemented, overworld combat exploded between the factions. The area between South Shore and Tarren Mill became the main back and forth of an endless battle, with the winning side eventually occupying their enemy's town. One of the problems with this system was it made the player versus player zones unviable for questing. The next patch had to increase the power of guards, making towns safer, but diminishing the original vision of the game. Later, the developers added battlegrounds, instance areas dedicated only to player versus player. Because they awarded more honor, this eventually evacuated PvPers from the overworld. Due to population, however, many servers only had one battleground running at a time. Faction imbalance created an issue, where with more Alliance players than Horde, the Horde would always queue instantly, while the Alliance had to wait in line. With a smaller, more cohesive community and more practice, the Horde would win most battlegrounds. This contributed to the idea of cross-realm battlegrounds, the first implementation of being able to group with those on other servers. While this resolved one problem and let players fight in PvP constantly, it was the start of a loss of community in the game, as you were now with players you'd never be able to interact with in the world. One of the things lost from this time is the original Alterac Valley. The first concept of the battleground was a hybrid of player versus player and player versus environment. The battle would go on, usually with one battle line fighting, somewhere in the middle of the zone. As these approached the opposing side, however, players ran into the issue of the towers. Computer-controlled archers would take out most players. Behind the lines, other players could do quests to increase the power of computer-controlled allies. These, like the Griffin or Ram Riders, could seize the towers and rapidly advance their side's lines. This meant both PvPers and PvEers were contributing to their side. In a later patch came the Dire Maul dungeon in Feralis, a large area to explore, featuring an arena and 3 wings. Its strong enemies meant groups had to use crowd control to navigate it. The dungeon included the epic mount quests for warlocks and paladins, the warrior book for their endgame sword, and a neutral Night Elf faction that provided rare enchantments. The dungeon also had a unique mechanic, where players could sneak through it and avoid fighting, only defeating the final boss and being proclaimed the Ogre King. As the developers of Warcraft had been EverQuest veterans, the apogee of the game consisted of raids. huge groups of players forming armies to fight the largest enemies like dragons. Raiding soon became a pillar of the game. In the early days, players would run Scholomance and Stratholme as 10-man raids, though they were later changed into exclusively 5-man dungeons. This increased their difficulty and demanded more game knowledge from players. The end dungeon for most players, however, was Molten Core, a sprawling 40-man dungeon focused on fighting fire elementals and giants, and dropping exclusively epic quality loot. Another of the end bosses was Onyxia, the dragon who had disguised herself as a noble to undermine the kingdom of Stormwind. Like in classic fantasy, your job was to slay the dragon. The fight required a high level of skill and coordination, the raid having to position itself properly and adapt to the fight's different phases. Following Molten Core, a new raid was released called Blackwing Lair, which had stronger enemies and better loot. Though this was the beginning of the raiding cycle, players finishing one dungeon to upgrade their items in the next, then reaching the expansion pack where all their items would become obsolete. The developers later released the 20-man raid Zul'Gurub, which in some ways came too late in the development of Classic. Realizing players needed a transition from the 15-man raid of Upper Blackrock Spire to the 40-man raid of Molten Core, it was added as a transition. Next came a 40-man and a 20-man in Silithus, which required a server-wide effort to open. Eventually, the developers added upgrades to the 5-man dungeon sets, which for non-raiders constituted the end of the game. Though at the same time, this felt like a patronizing token, after all the resources dedicated to raiding. Finally, the last elite dungeon added was Naxxramas, the final piece of content before the expansion pack, the Burning Crusade. Context is important in understanding the significance of any event. In a previous video, we spoke about the Blair Witch Project, which was as impactful as it came out just when portable cameras had become accessible to the public. World of Warcraft came out in 2004, in the age of the early internet. At this time, the internet was crude. Things had improved from the dial-up of the 90s, when going online tied up the phone line, but the internet still remained undeveloped and primitive. Email was becoming more popular, though was nowhere as ubiquitous as today, when it's phased out physical letters. Instant messenger and video chat existed, but were still uncommon, the latter only becoming widely accepted after the coronavirus pandemic. At the time, it was a totally novel idea. You could make friends over the computer. And when the game came out, there was no Facebook, and only a couple of years into it did the first social media site, MySpace, appear. There was no popular free social app like Discord, and even Steam Chat didn't exist. This created an incentive to stay subscribed, as the only way to stay in touch with your online friends was through the game. One of the wisdoms of Warcraft was to simply provide a social platform for players, then let them create the bonds between each other to keep them playing. The game showed the potential of the internet as a way to connect with people, creating relationships in a wholly digital sphere. At the time, a major social website was something awful, a source for the period's subversive humor. Two of my early guildmates, who inspired my own sense of humor, were something awful users. The site also had a guild called the Goon Squad, which created a lot of connections, like Simon and Lewis of the Yogscast. Initially, there was no website where you could learn about the game. There were paperback guides, but they usually just focused on the starter zones, which meant for the rest of the game, you had to learn through direct experience. You could also ask other players, one of the ways the game forced social interaction. Later, the website ThoughtBot became the first database of the game. I think this is one of the variables that can't be recreated today. Even if you don't use them, every modern game has a guide for it online. This takes away the feeling of novelty when you're the discoverer of things for the first time. A litany of role-playing games came out over the years to challenge World of Warcraft, and one after the other, they failed to replace Blizzard's Age of Conan, Warhammer Online, Rift and WildStar, all tried and only came off as imitators. Ultimately, World of Warcraft created the first true virtual reality world, a space where you could learn and discover. Today, companies like Facebook are exploring the idea of virtual reality, though for now it remains crude, cumbersome, and spoiled by motion sickness. But for them, World of Warcraft remains a template for how to make a virtual social space that's engaging and fulfilling. When it was new, World of Warcraft captivated a generation of young people, and watching the long hours they invested in playing it caused some media commenters to call it addicting. It's true, players often got so invested in Warcraft they neglected other games, and when they got tired of playing their main character, they often took a break by making another one called an alt, meaning even when they were taking a break from World of Warcraft, they were still playing it. One of the questions is why the game is so appealing, why it consumes so many people's youths, and continues to be played today. The game's provoked analysis over the years, with sociologists even taking an interest in it when the corrupted blood plague was spread in cities by players' pets. While its developers didn't know they were doing this, they created a world that fulfills many social and psychological needs. The game allows us to explore our sense of identity. It fulfills our needs to feel competent and autonomous. It creates a feeling of relatedness from forced socialization, and creates a sense of community, which instills a shared feeling of purpose and meaning. World of Warcraft creates a form of escape. If you live in a small apartment with little space, the vastness of its world is an outlet. When you make a character, it lets you explore your sense of self, change your appearance, height, or gender, or turn into someone completely different than you are in real life. World of Warcraft is an ideal world, one where the spirit survives the body. It's a world where people become heroes, and magic is possible. An important principle in World of Warcraft is poverty. There's something about impoverishment, about starting in a world poor or with nothing, and slowly working yourself up first to subsistence, and then success, that's deeply psychologically fulfilling. This effect is so universal that it must come from something deep in human nature. If you can work your way up from nothing, and do so from your own efforts and not the aid of others, there's a feeling of achievement. But this only happens if there's also frustration, time, and hardship that slow your progress. When you're level 1, the game starts you with as little as possible. You begin the game with a simple class garb, no money, and 1 or 2 basic spells. As you go through the first zone, you learn the exclamation mark NPCs, give you quests, which then introduce you to combat, teach you how your class functions, and show you how to train your skills. The game introduces you to its principles gently, starting you in a small area with clear, simple quests to guide you. They take you from place to place, and are tutorials to teach you the game. The player gets their first level quickly, giving an immediate power boost and a sense of reward. Slowly they're conditioned to feel fulfillment from each level or new experience. Each level takes slightly longer to achieve, with the early ones going quickly to help invest you in the game. Your first items are some of the lowest quality, and have you focus on increasing your armor, even if it only has a negligible effect. You also look for items that have more melee damage, having value even for casters at this time when they use up their mana pool. Slowly you fill all your item slots, and by level 10 you encounter your first screen item, a magic item that increases one of your stats. While initially you can't be discerning about these, as time goes on, you're able to acquire items that let you customize your character. For example, a protection warrior may prioritize stamina, while a fury warrior may focus on strength and agility. After about 20 levels, you find your first shoulders, and even though they're usually gray or a low-quality item, it feels like an accomplishment to have an item in that slot. You slowly fill each one, though those that remain empty for some time are the trinket slots. Your gear becomes more and more meaningful, and finally by the time you do your first dungeon at 20, you start to add rare and powerful items of higher quality. The item design varies, with some sets well made and others eccentric looking. Since you'll usually have items from different locations, the mixing and matching can make your character look ridiculous. I think the game intentionally makes you look silly at different points, like your 50s, just before you reach the level cap, to instill a feeling of reward when you get the endgame sets later. World of Warcraft provided a simple simulation of economics. Money was made through farming, killing enemies or mobs over and over, and from gathering professions like mining, amassing a large amount of a resource like ore or cloth, and selling it on the auction house. The auction house provided a good system of trade, though it took a cut of your profits and penalized you if your item didn't sell. It spared you the tedium of having to sit in the trade channel, spamming or marketing your item. The item could be bought immediately for a buyout, or otherwise bid on for a lower price. There were originally 2 auction houses, one in Ironforge and one in Orgrimmar, making those the faction capitals. The basic strategy was to undercut your competitors when you posted an item, though you could also corner the market and control the sale of a single resource, even buying out your competitors so you could resell the item at a higher price. Other than amassing resources, you could level up a profession that made finished goods or provided a service like enchanting, finding something in demand by players and selling it. These professions cost a lot to level up, and these expenses had to be paid off before making a profit. This was why starting players were encouraged to take the cheap gathering professions first when starting the game. As players advanced economically, they went through the different currencies of copper, silver, and gold. Like in a medieval economy, peasants dealt mostly in copper and eventually silver, while gold was only seen by the aristocracy. This created a sense of progress. Money had value as it was constantly subtracted from players over time, through training, leveling professions, repairs, buying upgrades on the auction house, and flights. Many of these costs became invisible, but some game modifications helped keep track of this and showed how high these expenses became. The classic version of the game stopped at 60, which created a good balance in the value of gold. With each expansion came an economic transformation, the value of the in-game currency decreasing each time. Though some players would devote themselves to amassing wealth, the game didn't have a leaderboard to show who the richest players were. Unlike a real economic game, there was no system of assets or appreciation, like interest in the bank. As the server aged, the game did have a simple system of inflation. On mature servers with most players at 60, gold became common, and even low-level items would become costly, as 60s were willing to pay more for the convenience of just getting the item they wanted immediately. At the same time, this allowed low-level players to sell items on the auction house and get the gold they needed early on. In daily life, you can work endlessly at a goal and achieve nothing. The world is unfair, giving massive advantages to those who are born ahead, and punishing those who fall behind through the idea of cumulative advantage. In World of Warcraft, the world begins on an even playing field, everyone entering the game in the same impoverished way. In Warcraft, though it may be time-consuming or difficult, the world is fair. Unlike in the real world, if you work and put in time, eventually you'll be rewarded. If you play long enough, eventually you'll reach level 60. If you do a dungeon enough times, you'll eventually get the item you want. And if you grind the snow tigers in Winterspring, eventually you'll get the unique mount. In the cities, you can see others' items and track their progress. Doing so creates a sense of comparison. However, unlike in real life, it's possible for all players to rise through the ranks and get their own epic items. Luck is a variable in the game, just like it is in real life. A player can fail to save money for their mount at 40, then suddenly have a rare item drop when questing, and sell it for all they need. Just like luck functions in the real world, fairness is an essential principle to invest people in the game. World of Warcraft forces new players to walk everywhere, which creates a sense of scale to the world. Slowing the world down also means more moments of spontaneous social interactions. It means if you encounter someone, it's more likely that you'll interact with them. Some classes have access to travel forms, but all have to wait until 40 to get a mount. Each race has their own unique one, including horses, rams, and wolves. Mounts give the player a large speed boost to navigate the game, letting them experience the world in a new way. The long wait to get them, as well as their cost, also makes them into status symbols, especially when the game was new. One of the major requests of players throughout Classic was the introduction of flying mounts. Flying existed through flight masters, and flight existed in the lore, but personal flying mounts were unavailable to players. The issue was the overworld had not been made for flying. Certain areas were meant to be inaccessible because they were incomplete, and if the player found them, they could see where textures ended, and the map stopped being developed. Because the expansion The Burning Crusade added a new separate continent entirely, it was made with the idea of flying. On reaching the new level cap of 70, players could buy a flying mount limited to Outland. The mount even provided utility, with some areas like raids only accessible to players with flight. Adding flying was an often requested feature, but it's one of the changes that worsened the experience of the game. Eventually, flying mounts were added to the base world, and they began to change the experience. With flight, the game becomes more solitary. While it's already difficult to keep the world inhabited as it is, with the limitless expanse of the sky, the amount of spontaneous social interactions decreases, as well as the amount of forced PvP. As we mentioned before, when YouTube was a new website, its largest search was for World of Warcraft, showing the following of the game. The population of the game increased over time, reaching subscriber numbers of over 8 million people. This meant the game had a following as large as an American state, or a small European country. Due to this, the game developed its own culture, with portrayals in comics and television shows and celebrity endorsements, though it manifested most uniquely in player-made films. When video sharing and streaming were new, there was a website that tried to capitalize on the new medium of video game media, and potentially even providing income to its creators, called Machinima. The contracts between it and its creators were highly restrictive, and even with them, the company still wasn't able to be economically viable. Despite this, it was the host for a number of Warcraft videos, many of which can be watched on YouTube now. Some of these include Illegal Danish, and Rurikar's videos on Mojachi and Crystal Water and You. One popular video showed a paladin charging into the Whelp Room in Blackrock Spire and wiping the group, while another was a real recording of a guildmaster screaming in broken English and yelling at his raid during an abortive attempt at Onyxia. Some of the best quality, and still on YouTube today, is the Grind series made by McKeith. World of Warcraft came out at an interesting time for the internet. In the early 2000s, the internet was a new frontier. Its novelty, vastness, and anonymity created a deep feeling of wonder over its potential. Freed from the usual social constraints, this impulse resulted in the removal of the usual moral restraints on behavior. People started trolling for entertainment. Inspired by sites like Something Awful with its guild, the Goon Squad, subversive comedy became expected. For some players, this type of conduct became their endgame, irritating and annoying other players as a way to occupy their time. This involves stealing loot, insulting players, or trolling chat channels, writing things so ridiculous it would elicit angry responses. As people took the game far too seriously, these all elicited over-the-top responses. A famous example of this was the guild Serenity Now, famous for attacking a funeral service for a player who died in real life. At the same time, the in-game event was held in a hostile zone on a PvP server, and the player himself had been a fan of PvP. Servers had their own forum and guild drama, entertaining and investing people, and making the world feel real and lived in. After the success of the original game, the next question was how to develop it into the future. One of the consequences of the game being developed by veteran EverQuest players was for further development to focus on raiding. As we said, these created the sense of epic, large player armies facing the strongest enemies in the game. However, they changed the social dynamic established by the rest of the game. 40-man raids produced anonymity, and reduce the value of individual contribution. In a 5-person dungeon, communication and coordination were essential, and each person had to contribute. In Classic, most players didn't raid, and most never stepped foot in Molten Core. This meant in their design focus, the developers were effectively making content for themselves. Out of the 12 patches for the original game, 6 of them were focused on raid content. This became most egregious with the final Naxxramas expansion, which less than 1% of players entered. So few people experienced it, it was later re-released as a lower-level dungeon. As they turned to the first expansion pack, the developers had to make several design decisions. Should the original level cap of 60 be maintained, or should it be raised higher? A higher level and a new continent also meant an increasing barrier of entry to the game, with new players forced to play catch-up with older ones who had already gone through the older content. It meant to play the game required additional purchases, a customer not only buying the original box, but its expansions in addition to the monthly subscription cost. If the company lowered the prices of its expansions later, or provided special offers, it would annoy older players who had to buy them at their full price. Despite this, for the first 2 expansions, Blizzard didn't run into this issue, as players were devoted enough to accept the costs. A fear of the aging game was obsolescence, with the graphics and standards of the original game being dwarfed by newer titles. Confronted with this, similar games created sequels, but this created the problem of splitting the player base, creating confusion and making the experience worse for everyone. Avoiding this pitfall, Blizzard stuck with the original game, and eventually went with the newer practice of visually remastering games, and they did this in the 2010s. Rather than finishing the Overworld, which still had incomplete areas like Hyjal and Uldum, the first expansion, The Burning Crusade, introduced the new continent of Outland, located through the Dark Portal in the Blasted Lands. A challenge, as with all expansion packs, was that by expanding the scale of the worlds, there was a gradual dilution of the overworld, lowering the population density and making it feel less inhabited or lived in. The decision was made to expand the level cap to 70, having new players level on Outland for the last 10 levels, rather than retaining the end of 60. Keeping the game at 60 would have prevented the obsolescence of high-level raiding gear, as well as the value of gold. After 6 patches for raiders, future content could have focused on the remaining player base. As we've explored before, the Burning Crusade was the beginning of the slow erosion of clear class roles and identities, as more classes became able to do everything. Paladins and shamans became available to both factions, and Blood Elves were added to the Horde as an attractive race, to try to balance the number of players on each side. As we mentioned earlier, the central story character of Warcraft III was Arthas. After leaving him at the end of the strategy game, he went unseen through most of World of Warcraft. Instead, players fought as lower-level lieutenants, who were the end bosses in the Undead or Scourge dungeons. The second expansion pack, Wrath of the Lich King, finally finished the narrative of this central character, adding the new continent of Northrend above Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms. Having learned the issue of funneling new players into one starting zone in Outland, Blizzard created multiple entryways onto the new continent. At this point, the principles of game design were well established. Quests overlapped and guided the player from area to area, creating a smooth experience. Northrend had some of the most aesthetically pleasing areas in the game, and though some feared the continent would lack variety and only have tundra environments, the developers were able to include a variety of northerly spaces. Unlike the mistake of Naxxramas, the Arthas fight was possible in multiple group types, ensuring most players would be able to see the story that concluded the game. After his betrayals of allies, Path of Destruction, and tyranny over the world, the players finally defeated him. After the defeat of Arthas, the game reached its highest numbers of subscribers with the release of the third expansion, which elicited huge amounts of excitement with its ambitious decision to destroy and remake all the game's old content. In the short term, it meant a totally new experience for all the players in the world. Many YouTubers like the Yogscast and Total Biscuit rose to prominence during this time. The new content was made with the modern, streamlined principles of game design, quests synergizing with each other, and guiding the player with clear directions of where to go. After the novelty wore off, however, the remake began to feel too formulaic, too easy, and without the scarcity, charm, and imperfection of the original game. With the player so guided, there was a loss of a sense of it being an authentic world. After the initial surge of excitement caused by the release of Cataclysm, the game began its long process of decline. Previously, during its meteoric rise in popularity, Blizzard had released counts of its numbers of players, though after Cataclysm its numbers started to decline, and they ceased following this practice. As the game developed further, the original vision of it continued to withdraw. The Pandaren, considered more an Easter egg than a real part of the universe, were added and given their own Chinese-themed continent. Community, a core pillar of Classic, declined further. Cross-realm content, which began first with Battlegrounds, was implemented on the Overworld, so small servers will be able to see other players in the world. Yet this destroyed the last vestiges of continuity, where the same players you'd see at the start of the game in Westfall, you'd meet again later when raiding. A better approach to this would have been merging small servers instead. Another issue of the game, from a political perspective, was the problem of constant war. Though the word was a part of the title, an appeal of the original game was it was about fledgling or fragile kingdoms, trying to function in a larger world. As we said, the Forsaken just began in Azeroth, and allied with the Horde to protect itself. Stormwind had just been rebuilt, and the Orcs were new settler colonists on Kalimdor. In the real world, states need time to develop, and real societies experience war exhaustion and need time to recover after war. Fighting wars constantly eventually results in state collapse. In addition, from a narrative point of view, wars are more meaningful if they're infrequent and purposeful. Instead, the game careened from one over-the-top war to another, without an underlying sense of politics. The game could have expanded its economic system, created a system of interest or money lending, or added player housing, an idea in the original game. The game could have added a diplomatic system, cross-faction communication, or visiting hostile cities. Though these are directions Blizzard didn't follow, they're being explored now on private servers. Logging on to later versions of the game, older players found it unrecognizable. Cities felt insular, like each player was in their own world. Items all became fantastic looking, diminishing their role as gauges of hierarchy. New races like the Fox and Dragon peoples felt alien to the game's lore. New features like Dungeon Finder auto-created your group and instantly teleported you to the dungeon, removing most elements of forced socialization. Individual enemies were so weak they required no crowd control, the tank using area of effects spells to hold threat. And the dungeons were so low in difficulty, they required no communication at all. Despite these changes, no empire reigns forever, and the game had simply gone through a large number of years. It had had a spectacular rise from 2004 to 10, as the largest and most successful game in the world. The reality is its greatest memories had already been had, and like The Simpsons or Game of Thrones, had passed its golden age to the era of decline. It was here where, ultimately, the interest in reviving old or classic servers began, which make up a big part of the game's market today. Early private realms included the Phoenix and Chronos servers, and later the extremely popular Nostalrius. After being shut down by Blizzard, the company released its own classic servers, though disappointed players with poor customer service and no policing of botting or gold farming. In addition, Fresh Realms created the state of continual cycling. Like in a new ladder for Diablo, Players would surge onto a new realm, speed through the content, and then retire, only to do it again on a new server. This was an impediment to creating a sense of community, as it meant you were playing on a server with a finite lifespan. New servers, without a concept of life cycling, have come up recently, offering a close to Blizz-like experience, supported by private funding. If we return to the company Blizzard, which we discussed at the beginning of the video, we established by the early 2000s, the company had reached its apogee in terms of artistic integrity. The company's value system prized innovation and quality. David Brevik discussed this in one interview about Blizzard South, the company deciding to scrap a project that, while okay, wasn't remarkable enough to be released and would ultimately have had a deleterious influence on the company's brand and reputation. In the market of the 2000s, Blizzard's reputation allowed it to release repeated commercial successes. Yet the success of World of Warcraft itself changed Blizzard as a company. Its challenge was in maintaining its integrity as it rose in celebrity, went through periods of corporate acquisition, and had to switch to the goal of serving stockholders. To maintain itself and its staff, Blizzard was initially acquired by the French media company Vivendi. This in itself did bring some changes. Vivendi was Blizzard's owner during the release of World of Warcraft in its early era. Blizzard faced the most challenges after it was divested from Vivendi and merged with fellow gaming company Activision, famous for the Call of Duty series. This shift was the beginning of a major transition, with Blizzard focusing more on its shareholders than its values. We can see this in the acquisition of the company King, which focused on mobile phone games. While traditional gamers don't realize this, they're actually some of the most lucrative. If you listen to Blizzard's earning calls, you can observe how phone games became its most profitable sector. Yet this diluted focus and alienated traditional fans. In one famous incident, the company hyped the release of a new Diablo title, many believing it was the announcement of Diablo IV. Yet the company, without irony, announced the release of a phone game, not understanding its own fan base, and showing how out of touch Blizzard's internal culture had become. A promising change occurred for Blizzard in its acquisition by Microsoft in 2023, one of the most financially stable and well-capitalized companies in the world. With a long history of game production and a more mature corporate culture, it represents a potentially huge departure from the dysfunction of the Activision era. Microsoft ultimately chose an appointment to clean up the company's culture. In the short term, this means a stabilization and taming of the company, and then potentially the possibility of new innovation in the future. World of Warcraft was a cultural touchstone that impacted many people's lives. An escape from the banality of work, it represents a departure into a world of magic and heroism. The game creates a fair world where work is rewarded and you can climb the hierarchy. It creates a lived-in continuous world where you can participate in a community and build friendships and relationships. It has the power to elicit feelings of wonder and discovery, and teach you things like how to navigate the world and social challenges. The game allows you to explore your identity. It gives you a sense of purpose, value, and uniqueness. It allows you to engage in a plot that will change the history of its world. It introduces you to archetypes, ideas like the priest, warrior, and magician. It balances the variables of difficulty and accessibility to create an engaging experience, eliciting great nostalgia in people. Due to all these factors, World of Warcraft has become one of the most enduring games in the world.